In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of tissues by taking a look at connective tissue. We'll do some introductory remarks, we're just kind of introducing what connective tissue is, and then we'll take a look at connective tissue proper. So you could think of connective tissue as a whole group of supporting tissues. There's actually a lot of subtypes that we're going to look at over the next couple lessons. We're going to see that connective tissues have three primary components. They're going to contain specialized cells, which I'm going to go over with you, are the different types of cells. They contain extracellular protein fibers. For example, you may know of one called collagen, right? That's one that we're going to talk about. So we'll take a look at three different protein fibers. And these cells and these protein fibers are embedded in a fluid, right? Even though it's kind of like a thick kind of fluid, this fluid is called ground substance. Now, we do use a term known as the matrix. The matrix consists of the ground substance and the protein fibers. We're going to see as we look at the different connective tissues, the matrix is really the majority of the tissue volume, and what's in the matrix basically determines the different functions of the connective tissue. So let's take a look at some of the functions that we're going to see. This is kind of a general slide overviewing the functions. As we go through each individual connective tissue, right, you'll see them more specifically. So number one, our connective tissues actually establish a structural framework for the body. You don't have to write this down now, but we're going to see that bone and cartilage are connective tissues. They form our framing, right? Um, some connective tissues transport fluids and dissolve materials. You're going to see, guys, that blood and lymph are also connective tissues. Some connective tissues protect delicate organs. We're going to see that fat, all right, fat cells are connective tissue, and a lot of times they pack our organs. As an example, don't write this down now, this is all for later. Our kidneys are packed in fat, right? Our heart has fat on it. We're also going to see that connective tissues are going to be supporting, surrounding, and interconnecting with other types of tissue, right? We'll actually see that our connective tissues interact with like epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. The next dot kind of goes back to fat again, right? Storing energy reserves in the form of triglycerides. That's our fat cells, right? We call them adipocytes. That is a type of connective tissue. And then finally, the last dot kind of goes back to blood, right? We have in our blood certain cells that defend the body from invading organisms, right? Certain white blood cells. And again, we'll go over that also. All right, so this is just a general slide going over the functions of connective tissue. And again, in the subsequent lessons, we'll take a look at each one in more detail. So let's categorize connective tissue. If you have your notes, you can highlight right here, highlight connective tissue proper, then go down a little bit and highlight fluid connective tissues, and then highlight support connective tissues. Right, so there's three main categories. The first category is connective tissue proper, right? That's what we're going to be talking about in this lesson. Now, this contains a variety of different cells and also fibers in a viscous ground substance. Viscous means thick, kind of syrupy, right? Not watery, but kind of thick. Now, we're going to see that our connective tissue proper, its job is to connect and protect, kind of holding us together and then also protecting us. We're going to see, guys, that there's two subcategories of connective tissue proper. There's something known as loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, right? So these make up connective tissue proper. And when you see this, this will make a little bit more sense. But generally, loose connective tissue has more ground substance and less fibers. Okay, fewer fibers. An example of that we're going to see is known as adipose tissue or fat. That's one example. I have some other ones also. Where dense connective tissue is predominantly going to be more fibers and not so much ground substance. So it's going to look more dense because we have a lot more fibers there. Our ligaments and tendons would be awesome examples of that. Okay, so again, in this lesson, we are going to be predominantly focusing on connective tissue proper, but this is just an overview slide. The fluid connective tissues, I do this one in a separate video, a separate lesson, that's going to be to function, or its function is going to be transport. And the two tissues are blood and lymph. So we're just going to introduce them this semester, to some of the main highlights. In AMP2, we study them in much more detail. Finally, the third category of connective tissue is the support or supporting connective tissues. And this is going to give us structure, right? Structural strength. We're going to see that that is made up of cartilage and bone. Right? We see that cartilage has three types. We're going to look at hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Again, I do those in a separate lesson. We're not going to cover those now. We'll do that in a separate lesson. And then we're going to also look at bone, of which we see there's two types, spongy and compact, right? Again, that's also in a subsequent lesson, a future lesson. So let's do connective tissue proper, right? We're going to do connective tissue proper now. That'll be the remainder of this lesson. And as we said before, guys, our connective tissues have cells, fibers, and ground substance. So let me introduce to you the different types of cells. Look at all these that we can see in connective tissue proper. Right? Some connective tissue proper have all of the cells. Some connective tissue proper have some of these. So these are all like the possibilities of cells. Right? So this is an overview slide. Fibroblasts, fibrocytes, adipocytes, mesenchymal cells, melanocytes, macrophages, mast cells, lymphocytes, and microphages. These last one, two, three, four are all types of white blood cells, believe it or not. So not only do we have white blood cells in our blood, we also have them in our tissues. So let's take a look at each one of these cells, just a little bit about their function. The first ones are the fibroblasts. These are the most abundant cell type. These are found in all of the connective tissue propers. They secrete a chemical known as hyaluronan, which is basically cellular cement. We actually mentioned a little bit of this in epithelial tissue. And along with the extracellular fluid and proteins, this hyaluronan makes the ground substance thick. It makes it viscous. We also see that the fibroblasts produce proteins, right? So we're producing the cellular cement, hyaluronan, and then also protein fibers. Blast cells, as a general rule, guys, are going to produce things. Now, once the blast cell produces everything that it needs to produce, the blast cell is going to convert to a site. All right, the adult cell, or this cell here, is known as a fibrocyte. A lot of times we consider the fibroblast like the immature or the child cell, and then eventually it will become the site. One of the major things about site cells is their job is to maintain the connective tissue. Right? So the blast cells produce the connective tissue, the sites maintain. We're going to see that throughout the semester. So this is the second most abundant cell type, and as I mentioned before, they come from fibroblasts, and that's what I'm saying here. They differentiate from the fibroblasts, and their job is to maintain the connective tissues. So we have a picture in our book. You don't have to memorize this. I just thought since they have it, I'll show it to you. Right here, they're actually showing you the fibroblasts. Right, so that's the immature cell that's producing the fibers and the ground substance, and then the fibrocyte is going to be like the adult form. Once these are formed, these are their job is to maintain. Adipocytes are just a fancy word for fat cells, right? So these are our adipocytes. Each one of these cells will store a single fat droplet, right? We know from chemistry that is known as a triglyceride. Now, the number of adipocytes is going to vary, right, within different tissues, regions of the body, and also from our kind of our genetics from person to person, right? So it's not always going to be the same. And again, we'll point that out as you go through your studies in anatomy and physiology. Another type of cell is known as mesenchymal cell. Think of these cells, guys, as stem cells. Right, so we have these different stem cells. They're in our connective tissues, and they just kind of hang out. But once they're stimulated from either an infection or maybe injury, these stem cells can turn into different cells that we need for repair. For instance, if we had to make new connective tissue, they could turn into fibroblasts, right? Because if you remember from the previous slide, what did fibroblasts do? They make the connective tissue. They could become a macrophage, which is a phagocytic cell. That's a cell that fights infection, or any other connective tissue cell that we need. So these are very valuable cells, right? Just think of them, though, as stem cells. Another type of cell that we see in connective tissue is melanocytes. Now, most of us think of melanocytes in our skin, right, in our epidermis, producing our skin color. That's because melanocytes are indeed in the skin, especially our epidermis, and they're responsible for our skin color. And they produce a pigment known as melanin, right? I have that right over here for you. These synthesize and store a brown pigment known as melanin. And again, I'll even show you how the melanin gets into the skin when we do the lecture on the integumentary system, again, at a future date. Now, as far as connective tissue, melanocytes are also abundant in connective tissues of the eye and the dermis of the skin, which is the lower part of the skin, not which is right below the epidermis. This is also, again, the amount of melanocytes is going to be variable from in individuals. But I do want you to know that we do have melanocytes in our connective tissue also. So again, just to show you guys, again, this is just like a generic picture of some connective tissue. You can see the adipocytes, right, are usually kind of big cells. Here's like the fat droplet inside there. Here's the mesenchymal cell. And then this brown one over here, which looks like an octopus, has extensions on it, is the melanocyte. Again, we're going to study this cell when we do the integumentary system, and we'll look at that cell, the melanocyte, in much more detail. The remaining four cells are white blood cells, guys. So macrophages are really important cells. These are large phagocytic cells, meaning that they do cellular eating, right? Phagocytosis is cellular eating, right? And they're a big part of our immune system. So their job is to not is to engulf pathogens. Again, if you don't know what this word pathogen means, it's a disease causing organism, right? So they engulf pathogens or even damaged cells. Maybe we have some type of an injury and we have cells that are, that are dead or whatever. We want to get rid of them. We don't want to keep them. So the macrophages will gobble them up for us. Now, these macrophages also, they're important in the immune response. They release different chemicals which actually stimulate the immune system so that more cells come down and will fight, whatever it may be, the infection, that type of thing. Now, sometimes, or not sometimes, we have two different types of macrophages. A fixed macrophage is one that just kind of stays put in the connective tissue. While a free macrophage can wander, it can migrate around. So there's just the two different types. Regardless, though, whether they're fixed or free, they're still going to do phagocytosis, right? They're still going to do phagocytosis. Another cell that we have inside our connective tissue, this is also in our blood cell, in our bloodstream, is also known as a mast cell. What these cells do is when we have an injury, these release some important chemical mediators of inflammation, meaning that they release chemicals that cause inflammation. Believe it or not, we're so programmed to think that inflammation is bad, that we don't want inflammation. We do need inflammation. It's part of the healing process. So that's why the mast cells will release these chemicals. One that you may know is histamine. Another one you may have heard of also is heparin, right? And again, you may even know this, right? When you have too much histamine and you have like a runny nose, say from hay fever or something like that, what's the medication you could take is an antihistamine, right? That stops your runny nose, right? Because that's blocking the inflammation chemicals. So the mast cell is important when we have injury or we have an infection, and it's releasing these chemicals that cause inflammation. Okay, the basophil is a white blood cell that's in our bloodstream. Leukocytes are white blood cells that also release histamine and heparin. So this would be like a comparable cell to the mast cell. Okay, let's take a look at those real quick. So here they're showing you some macrophages, right? This big cell right over here. That's a fixed macrophage. Here's a free macrophage. And over here is a mast cell. These little blue dots, they represent these things called granules, and those granules are where the chemicals of inflammation are stored. Again, you don't have to know that for now. I just figure I'll show you what it looks like. The last two types of cells are lymphocytes and a group known as macrophages. So lymphocytes also move throughout the body. What's interesting about these cells turn into something called the plasma cell. And what's important about the plasma cell is they produce our antibodies, right? You may have heard of like antibody A, D, E, G, M. Those are different antibodies. So they're produced by lymphocytes. So these antibodies, again, are important in fighting off different types of infection and things like that. Finally, guys, macrophages are also phagocytic cells. We're not going to study them this semester, but they're known as neutrophils and eosinophils. These are some of the cells that are actually attracted by the different chemicals that are released by the macrophages and the mast cells. Right? So these macrophages, if you go back in your notes a couple of seconds ago, I said to you release different chemicals that stimulate the immune response, right? Well, these are the cells that come down and help fight along with the macrophages. Now, we call these microphages. Those I don't have a picture of, but here's a lymphocyte. This is a classic picture of a lymphocyte. It's got like a big nucleus and not much cytoplasm. Over here is, I didn't circle it, but here's a plasma cell. And so this we have a little bit of an idea what the cells look like. Okay, so those are our cells that we can find in connective tissue proper. We also said that connective tissue has fibers. Let's take a look at the fibers that we see in connective tissue proper. There is collagen, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. Let's take a look at collagen. These are the most common fiber in connective tissue proper. If you were to look at them under the microscope, I mean, I'll show you a picture and some microscope slides of them. They're typically long, they're straight, and they don't branch. And they look pretty big. They're pretty easy to see under the microscope. Now, one of the main benefits, give a highlight right here, is that they are strong. Hey, if you pull on collagen, like from end to end, they say that collagen is stronger than steel, right? So they typically will resist force in one direction, but like a rope, collagen is kind of like flexible, but if you were to pull on that rope, that collagen would be very, very strong. We see it in a lot of tissues, but one a good example where we see a lot of collagen and these structures are very strong would be our ligaments and our tendons, right? Ligaments attach bone to bone. So if you think about your skeleton, right, guys, when you stand up, your bones don't separate from the weight of your body. Those ligaments are all made up of collagen that hold our bone together. Tendons connect muscle to bone, right? So when you work out, your muscles don't rip away from your bone. That's because the tendons are so strong. Okay, so that's the first fiber known as collagen. The second fiber I want to introduce to you, this one you probably haven't heard of. These are known as reticular fibers. Reticular means network. So these fibers form like more of a network. They kind of like branch out. We refer to this network of fibers, we sometimes call that the stroma. You may use that term more in AMP2. We don't really use it that much in AMP1. But if you ever hear it, that's what they're talking about. Now, the chemical that makes up our reticular fibers is the same proteins that are made up of collagen. However, the reticular fibers are thinner and they branch. So since they're made up of the same protein as collagen, they are also going to be considered to be flexible and strong. But since they branch, watch this, they can resist forces applied to it from many different directions, right? Since it's a branching network, right, we can pull on that tissue from various directions and that tissue is going to stay strong. Now, these reticular fibers in organs will support the functional cells of an organ. Let's just say, for instance, as an example, this is a little bit advanced. The reticular fibers make up the framework of the liver. Well, those liver cells live on that framework, right? The liver cells would be the functional cells, right? We sometimes refer to these functional cells as parenchyma. That's a term you don't hear all that often. We also see these reticular fibers, guys, stabilizing the position of blood vessels, nerves, and just other structures. A lot of times, if you're doing dissection, your initial dissecting, you're kind of ripping away some of these reticular fibers as you're kind of delving in and looking at blood vessels and nerves and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's the reticular fibers. Finally, the third fiber is the elastic fiber. Now, these contain a protein known as elastin. When you look at them under the microscope, they're a thin, kind of branched fiber. They have a little bit of waviness to them as you see them under different microscope slides. You'll see that they're wavy. Now, these have the benefit of this. You can stretch the elastic fiber, but then when you let go, they're going to return like kind of recoil back to their original shape. It's kind of like if you had a garment, a shirt or something like that that had an elastic band, right? You can stretch that elastic band, but then when you let go, it goes back to its original shape. We see the elastic fibers in a lot of different places in the body. One of the examples here is just that in our vertebrae, there are ligaments. Remember I said a second ago that ligaments that don't normally stretch, right? Ligaments are all collagen and they hold your bones together. But one of the reasons we're able to bend our spine in different positions is that some of the ligaments of the spine actually have elastic fibers. So these ligaments are actually holding the vertebrae together, but we still can stretch these ligaments, right? So they're kind of unique ligaments in the body. Most of our ligaments in the body that hold our skeletal system together, they don't stretch. Okay, so those are our three types of fibers: elastic, reticular, and collagen. So going back to this picture here, if you take a look at the collagen fibers, these big, thick ones here, guys, these are the collagen. Right? You can see that they don't branch, and they're pretty straight for the most part. The reticular fibers are these brown ones here. So now you see how these form more of like a network. They kind of branch out in different directions. So now you can pull on this tissue in many different directions and the tissue won't tear because the reticular fibers can withstand those forces from many different directions. And see these little thin ones right here, that kind of branch, they kind of remind me of like hair. When I see these on the microscope slide, they kind of just remind me like hair you want to brush away off of the slide. Those are your elastic fibers. Okay, so collagen, the big guys, reticular, the branching ones up here, forming like a little network, right? Reticular actually means network. And then the thinner branching ones are our elastic fibers. Okay, so we said that connective tissue proper has cells. We looked at the cells. We said that connective tissue proper has fibers. We just looked at the three fibers. And we also said those cells and fibers are embedded in ground substance. This was the third component of connective tissue. So in connective tissue proper, the ground substance is clear, colorless, and viscous. Viscous means thick, like syrupy, like a real thick syrup. And this ground substance basically fills the spaces between the cells, and from a kind of like a medical point of view, would slow down the movement of pathogens. Remember, if I said a couple of minutes ago, a pathogen is what? A disease causing organism. So you can see here, I have it circled over here. All this kind of pink area here would be the ground substance. So all these cells and fibers, guys, are living or suspended or supported in the ground substance. Okay, so on one of my introductory slides before, I had said to you that connective tissue proper is made up of loose connective tissue. We're going to see that there's three types of loose connective tissue, and then the other part of connective tissue proper is the dense connective tissue proper. There are three types of dense connective tissue. Let's look at the loose connective tissue first. Guys, think of the loose connective tissue as the packing material of our body. Kind of like if you got a package at home from UPS or Amazon or something like that, right? And you open up the box and there's the object that you bought, and then you have all those little like popcorns or bubbles, something around the object to protect it. That's what loose connective tissue is in our body, right? Think of it as the packing material of the body. It fills spaces between the organs. It stabilizes cells within the organs. It supports the epithelial tissue, right? When we looked at epithelium in previous lessons, always, always, always under epithelium was connective tissue, right? Now we're going to look at that connective tissue. So loose connective tissue, there are three types. We're going to look at areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue. These are the three types of loose connective tissue. So let's start with the areolar tissue first, areolar connective tissue. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute, but these are the least specialized of the connective tissues. Now, these may contain all of the cells, right? I say may because, again, it may or may not, right? And the fibers arranged in a very loose manner, and you'll see what I mean when you see it, right? The areolar tissue can distort without damage because of this loose arrangement. You can kind of compress it, and it won't be damaged because it's just very, very loose. It also has a viscous ground substance. Like I said, viscous means thick, so that allows the tissue to also absorb shock. And it contains elastic fibers. So once you put some type of pressure on it and you distort the tissue and you take that pressure off, it goes back to its original shape, right? So it is the perfect packing material. So here's what it looks like when you look at it. That just let me go back for a minute. Watch this. This picture I've been looking at, this is actually a kind of a diagram of areolar connective tissue. I didn't want to tell you that then. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the cells and the fibers and the ground substance. But this is actually areolar connective tissue, right? What you're going to see, guys, when you look at it, these pink kind of fibers right here, these are your collagen. Right, you can see those. The thin black lines right here are the elastic fibers. I don't see any reticular fibers. These blue dots right here, these are all just various cells. Right? And then the white area is the ground substance. Okay, so we see areolar connective tissue within and deep to the dermis of the skin. Right, when we study the integumentary system, guys, I'll show you that the areolar connective tissue is under the skin. It's also underneath epithelium. Right, we studied that when we did epithelial tissue. It's underneath the epithelial tissue of the digestive tract, urinary tract, respiratory tract, right? All of those systems that are open to the outside world. We find this areolar tissue, guys, between muscles, around joints. It packs our blood vessels and our nerves. Okay, so it's a really important packing material, right? It kind of cushions organs, provides support, but permits movement of these structures, right? And then it also has phagocytic cells, which we talked about, the macrophages and that kind of thing, to help fight off those bad guys. Okay, so that's the areolar connective tissue. The second type of loose connective tissue is adipose. So adipose contains many of our fat cells, which we had talked about earlier. Those are known as adipocytes. Okay, generally our adipose tissue, guys, is going to act as a padding. It's going to absorb shock. It's going to act as an insulator. It's going to also act as a packing material. It's going to kind of like fill spaces around structures, right? So very similar in that respect as far as being a packing material. It's very similar to adipose. As you go on in your studies through AMP1 and AMP2, you're going to see it kind of like all over the place. Now, adipose cells or adipocytes in adults do not divide. Basically, if you gain weight, your adipocytes are just kind of getting bigger, right? They fill up with triglycerides. When you lose weight, they shrink, they get smaller. Right, so for the most part, as you gain weight or lose weight, a little bit at a time, that's what's basically happening. But if you push your adipocytes, right, you're really bringing in a lot of calories, um, then you could stimulate the production of more adipocytes, right? And that's remember the mesenchymal cells are our stem cells? These can actually produce more fat cells when more storage is needed, right? So as a general rule, if you're kind of eating and exercising at the same time, you're not really like gaining or losing weight, you're at a kind of a normal body weight for you, your adipocytes just either get a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. But again, if you increase your calories more than you're burning, then these mesenchymal cells, those stem cells, can turn into fat cells. All right, this is just the last notch. This is kind of a by the way. Right, you may know of liposuction. That's actually a cosmetic surgery procedure where they go in and they kind of suck out the fat cells so that you can't continue to make them bigger if they're not there. This you may or may not know. We actually have two different types of fat. There's white fat and brown fat. Most commonly in adults, the fat that we have is known as white fat. It kind of looks like yellowy, whitish in color. You usually see it like if you were cooking, let's say you took a chicken and you kind of peel the skin back a little bit, that yellowish, whitish kind of stuff underneath the skin, that's white fat, guys, believe it or not. So that's the most common that we see in adults. Again, this is absorbing. It's kind of acts as a shock absorber. It stores lipids. It helps as an insulator, right? So that's pretty much what it does in adults. But when we are babies, usually like in the back of our neck and between our shoulder blades, we have this stuff called brown fat. The reason it's brown, it is more vascularized, so it looks a little bit darker. It also contains many mitochondria and it's stimulated by the nervous system. So when the baby, I guess, is cold, the nervous system will stimulate the breakdown of lipids in the brown fat, and that releases energy and it warms the baby. Okay, so it's kind of a survival thing. All right, so we call that brown fat, and again, in adults, we do not see that, right? We don't have that. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit about adipose tissue. So where do we find it in the body? Again, guys, it's always underneath our skin, right? It's in certain areas also, right? We find it more on our sides, in the buttock area, the breast tissue, padding around the eyes, and it also packs our organs. For example, the kidneys, you'll see this next semester, are packed in fat. Okay, so it provides padding and cushioning from shock. Uh, Fat is a good insulator, right? It helps us to keep our heat in our body. And again, it's long-term energy store, right? We make fat tissue or adipose tissue when we bring in more calories than we're burning. Now, when you see fat, what you're going to see are these large cells that kind of look like, cotton balls, soap bubbles to me. Notice what's missing in the middle. There's no nucleus. The reason for that is the fat droplet in here pushes the nucleus to the side. So you're going to see that the nucleus is peripheral, right? The other organelles are kind of stuck also over there. So the fat droplet pushes the nucleus to the side. Right, here's a great example here, right? This is a good fat cell right there. Look at that. That's its nucleus right there. All right, so when you see these cells, big cells, no centrally located nucleus, again, kind of cotton balls, soap bubble kind of appearance. Very easy to see. The third type of loose connective tissue, right? We're still doing the three loose connective tissues. The third type is reticular tissue. So this is obviously going to contain our reticular fibers. I didn't put it here. If you want to add it, you can. And those reticular fibers are going to Oh, I do have it here. They are going to provide support, right? So the reticular fibers form a complex, a three-dimensional stroma. Again, that's kind of like a framework, guys. And that framework is going to support the functional cells of an organ. The example I gave you before was the liver. Okay, the liver, the kidney, the spleen, our lymph nodes, even our bone marrow have this reticular tissue. These are all tissues, guys, or organs and tissues that we study next semester in AMP2. So when you look at some of the microscope slides in AMP2, you'll be able to see some of this reticular tissue. Again, so think of reticular tissue as kind of like a framework. It's forming a framework of these organs: liver, kidney, spleen, lymph nodes, bone marrow. And that framework is supporting the functional cells of the organs. Right? Again, sometimes we say those as parenchyma. That's just a term we use for the functional cells. So just to give you an example here, here's the liver, right? So they take a little section out of the liver, and you can see again all these kind of bluish cells. I'm sorry, all these bluish fibers right here. See how they're kind of branching and forming this network? That's the reticular fibers. And then the little purple dots, they are the nuclei of the liver cells, right? So these liver cells are supported by all of this framework right over here. Right? So again, here's a good picture. You can see again all the kind of staining black now, right? All these black fibers would be the reticular fibers, and then these would be the liver cells being supported by the reticular fibers. Right, if you were to look inside of a lymph node, it would look very similar, except that these cells here wouldn't be liver cells, they would be lymphocytes. All right, so again, these are things you're going to see in your more in AMP2. Okay, so we did the three types of loose connective tissue that make up connective tissue proper. What we want to do now are the three types of dense connective tissue. Okay, we sometimes call the dense connective tissue collagenous tissue. One of the reasons they call it that, it has an abundance of collagen fibers. Right, so some people do call it collagenous. The three types of dense connective tissue we're going to look at now, guys, are dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. All right, so these are the three types of dense connective tissue making up connective tissue proper. So let's look at dense regular connective tissue first. This is tightly packed parallel collagen fibers aligned with the forces applied to the tissue. So if you were to look at this under the microscope, and I'll show you a picture, you would see bundles of collagen all running in the same direction. And the places that we see this, guys, are in our tendons. If you want to give it a little highlight there, and our ligaments. Okay, and aponeurosis is a type of tendon. It's just a broad, flat tendon. These would contain dense, regular connective tissue. And like I said before, ligaments connect bone to bone, tendons connect muscle to bone. right? So these are very strong tissues, right? If you look over here, guys, these are collagen. Notice all the collagen is bundles of collagen all running parallel, right? They're all running in the same direction. So now if we pull on this tissue here and try to, pull it, right? That collagen is pretty strong. That's not going to let us, stretch. It's not going to let us stretch that. Okay. All right, so that again, here's the microscope slide. You can see again all the collagen. It's a little bit wavy, right? Like that. All that is parallel collagen, right? That is dense regular. Regular means that everything is parallel and uniform. The second type of connective tissue proper is dense irregular connective tissue. This time the collagen will be bundles, but the collagen is going to be running in all different directions, right? So they put here it's an interwoven network, right? The collagen is not going to be parallel. The collagen is going to be running in all different directions. What's the benefit of that? That gives us the ability to pull on this tissue from many different directions, and the tissue will not tear, right? It will not tear. So where do we see it? We see it in the lower part of the dermis, right? The dermis is the lower part of the skin, and this we found in the lower part of the dermis. We'll get into that in more detail, guys, when we do the integumentary system. We also see it in wrappings around cartilage known as the perichondrium and wrappings around the bone known as the periosteum. Okay, we'll talk about those in subsequent lessons on tissue. We also see it in AMP2. There are different organs that have capsules around them. That's made up of dense irregular connective tissue, the liver, the kidney, the spleen, the adrenal gland is another one. Okay, when I teach AMP2, I always have the students, when we look at the microscope, look for the capsule of the adrenal gland to help them locate different regions of the adrenal gland. So these are things you're going to look at as far as capsules in anatomy and physiology too. Let's take a look. So again, look here, guys. You can see all the collagen is just running in different directions. So here they took a little piece from the skin here, the lower part of the dermis, and you can see the collagen just running in all different directions. So no matter how you pulled on the skin in whatever direction and twist and tug on the skin, it's not going to rip, right? So here again, you can see the collagen running in all different directions. That's one of the main benefits. Again, it can resist forces from many different directions, right? The dense irregular, right, compared to dense regular, where the collagen is all running in the same direction. Okay, finally, the last of the connective tissue proper is elastic connective tissue. Now, this is going to have much more elastic fibers than it would collagen, right? So the elastic fibers predominate here. And the benefit of this is this tissue can be stretched and then it will recoil. Again, I had mentioned this earlier, the elastic ligaments of the spine, they're going to have elastic tissue. And next semester, guys, you'll see that some of the large arteries near the heart, when the heart pumps the blood into the arteries, those arteries need to expand a bit to absorb all that blood, right, to take in all that blood, and then they recoil to move the blood away from the heart. One of the blood vessels you may have heard of or you may know is the aorta. That has a lot of elastic tissue in it. So here again, they're showing you some of the ligaments of the spine as an example. But if you look here, if you kind of look at some of these black wavy lines, that's the elastic fibers. Even though it kind of does look like collagen when you look at this, the way they stain this, sometimes you would see more black lines in there, the wavy lines of the elastic fibers. But that's elastic tissue. Again, what predominates is going to be the elastic fibers. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on connective tissue proper, right? We reviewed again all the cells of connective tissue proper, the three different fibers. We looked at the ground substance, and then we looked at the actual connective tissue proper tissue types, right? We looked at the three loose connective tissues, areolar, adipose, and reticular, right? Those were the three loose. And then we finished off this lesson looking at the three dense: dense regular, dense, irregular, and elastic tissue.